Hello, everyone. So great to be here, and shout out to everyone being here for one of the last sessions of the day, the very, very last one. How's everyone doing? Okay, we may have the least people here, but we will be the loudest. I'm gonna ask again, ready? How's everyone doing? We good? There we go, there we go. I'm so excited to be here to be talking about and representing the most exciting tech ecosystem on the globe, the African tech ecosystem. And we have a fantastic panel here who are deep experts and have deep insights on that ecosystem. So here's what's going to happen today. First, I'm going to be running down what's happening across African tech and why we're excited for this green and digital economy and the stakes at hand for us. Then we're going to have each of these experts kind of dig into a key question within the African tech ecosystem. Then we'll do a quick round of short fire questions and get their perspectives on where they see Africa's tech ecosystem going. One thing before we start, though, is that we do have a way for you guys to ask questions towards the end of this event. So it's the Votemo app, which you can scan here. So if you have questions as we go along, punch them into the app, and we'll have a chance to answer those questions for you. All right. I realize I haven't introduced myself. My name is Caleb Maru, and I'm the CEO of a company called Tech Safari. We're an events and media platform that's focused on bringing Africa's tech story to the rest of the world, so connecting these bridges globally. And we're super excited to be partnered with Latitude59. We actually launched them in Kenya 2 years ago, and are long-standing partners in their Kenya edition, which, if you guys haven't been yet, I'd really encourage you guys to take the flight and come join us for that in December this year. So here's the scene, right? Here's what's happening. This session is called Wired for Impact, and it's talking about these two transitions. The first transition is a climate transition. So Africa has 60% of the world's best resources for solar and many other climate assets, but only 1% of that is utilized. And we're starting to see a rapid growth in the green economy across the African continent. The second is Africa's digital economy. So Google and IFC expect Africa's digital economy to hit $712 billion by 2050, which is huge. So we have this ecosystem that's growing rapidly with people, but also could be extremely tech-enabled and extremely green and climate-friendly. And so we want to understand a little bit more about this ecosystem with our brilliant panel here. So I want to go over to our first speaker, our first spotlight, Dr. Milu Dirks. Milu, tell us from your experience, what is an example or a case study of innovation that you've seen within Africa's digital economy?
Yeah. So hi, everybody. I'm Milu Dirks. I am the head of research at the Netherlands Enterprise Agency, focusing on entrepreneurship support across the African continent. And I mean, there's so many examples that I could name, but let me focus on one to really get the topic of digital and green innovation come to life for all of you. So in West Africa, we're supporting a company called Sanfre, and they offer cooled transport as a service. So they build these little motorbikes with big cool boxes on the back that fit about 1,000 liters that transport meat and vegetables from farmers to markets and from markets to bigger markets in the capital. They use sensors in the cool boxes to keep track of the temperature and to trace the trucks. And I think this is a really great example of digital and green innovation. And what stands out is not necessarily the tech solution, it's also the business model around it. Because when you're innovating in the green space on the African continent, then you often face a customer base in agriculture or in waste or in small-scale renewable energy that's not always able to pay for your solutions. So you need to find smart ways around it with pay-as-you-go or pay-as-you-can methods or subscription models. And they did that very well. But there's one thing that I find really important to remember, and that's that one company doesn't make a transition. So we're talking here about accelerating digital and green transitions. And for that to happen, we don't need a Sanfre only operating in TS, a city in South Senegal. We also need them in, or a similar company in Dakar, in Saint-Louis, in Côte d'Ivoire, in Benin. So to really accelerate transitions, we don't need one company adopting innovations, but 10 or 20 or 50.
That's awesome. And that's a great example, but it also kind of picks at a bigger point, one that you mentioned when we first discussed this topic, Milu, which is it's easy to say we need a lot of different solutions, or we need a solution replicated in different markets. But something that we often skip, or sometimes people can skip when they look at Africa, is thinking of it as monolithic. It's actually 54 countries and thousands more, actual groups. And so my question is, if you're building on the continent, how do you make sure that you're taking steps to make sure that you are sort of customizing or making sure it's locally relevant for that ecosystem? And what are some steps that others can take when they're looking at the African market?
Well, I think it's really important to realize, indeed, that all these 54, depending on who you ask, have different culture, different economies, different political and regulatory systems. So copy-pasting your solution doesn't work. And I think this is also why we've seen quite a few Western companies fail when they try to enter the African market. For example, if you look at the innovation of satellite imagery-based agricultural advice, you had some companies from the Western Hemisphere coming into West Africa, thinking, okay, we can give advice to farmers using an app, but then most farmers are not that digitally literate, so then they thought, okay, let's then use SMS or USSD, but even that didn't really fit the context. And then there was this local company in West Africa called Tolby, and they combined their solution with an AI bot that would call the farmers at the same time every day and give them advice in Wolof, in a local language, on when to use pesticide or fertilizer or water usage. So I think the key is not trying to have one big company that then goes into 10 different countries or 10 different regions, but to have a lot of smaller SME-like companies adopting similar innovations and helping those to grow.
That's awesome. Another great example as well. Thanks for that, Milo. Let's go over to Rim in the center here. I like that we started with these kind of practical examples, like real case studies of when that's worked and how the digital ecosystem looks. But I'd love to get to the sort of government perspective. And Rim, you're the perfect person to ask this question. So Smart Africa works with over 40 different government institutions. And I'd love to know, what do you think could be a massive unlock in unlocking more climate and digital, more of our climate and digital economy from a government perspective? What can governments be doing to engage more broadly with that ecosystem?
Thank you, Caleb, and thank you for having me and us here. So, as I said, my name is Rim, and I'm leading tech entrepreneurship at Smart Africa, and we are a Pan-African organization that our main mission is to support digital transformation and accelerate digital transformation across the continent. A government can do a lot. Depending on the context, it can do a lot, but what they can do is either acting on the offer or the demand. The offer is having the right environment to do business in these sectors, to create the business to create solution in these sectors, either on the research side, but also on the investment side. Governments, in most of the cases, are the biggest investor in these sectors. And they can either facilitate investment or guarantee investments. For example, in Tunisia, the government has created a sort of guarantee fund for investors and startups. They created incentives for investors and startups. They created some protections for investors in innovation more globally. And then on the demand side is incentivizing. So you will find in many of our countries, for example, many tax reliefs on electric vehicles, for example. Tax reliefs in any investment in renewable energy or smart energy. You can find also some prohibitions on, for example, on some categories of, of subcategories of non-climate change. Non-climate, I forgot the word in English anyway. So, yeah, so the high consumption equipments and so on and so forth, so they can do a lot. Either putting the right environment from policy perspective, where business in these areas can become very easy. Incentivize the investors or incentivize the customers for these businesses.
That's awesome. So it sounds like what government can do and has done in some ecosystems is, yeah, make it simple for investors to invest in that ecosystem.
And save some time. Building this trust between the investors and the ecosystem itself, either guaranteeing or incentivizing this kinds of things.
Fantastic. You did kind of pick at a few examples. You mentioned Tunisia. I'm wondering, are there any other great examples, maybe for the audience, that you could dig into that have incentivized investors to come in and also incentivized or kind of de-risked it for startups to be building in those ecosystems?
So from entrepreneurship perspective, many of the countries, many African countries have built policy and legal ecosystems. We can call startup acts or no. But they have created these legal frameworks, these bubbles for entrepreneurs to be able to innovate and create solutions without necessarily taking the burden of the usual path or the usual process for a businessman or for a company to create and to build solutions and businesses. And I can cite Tunisia, Senegal, Nigeria. There are some other countries that are in this process, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa. And it's usually a joint effort between the ecosystem itself and between the government to have this right environment. This is what we want, and this is what we want you to do. And on the other side, this is what we can do with what we have. And this dialogue is very important to put the environment there.
That's an awesome perspective. I like that because a lot of the time, as people in the tech space, as I'm sure there's a lot of us, we say government should be doing more, government should be doing more, but not enough times do we actually organize and say, hey, this is exactly what we want. Now let's have a dialogue. So I love that insight. Let's go over to the investor side. I'd love to skip over to the end with Tendai. We've now heard from like the specific case study level of what happens in Africa's digital economy. We've heard from a government perspective of what can happen to unlock more of this scale. Now, Tendai, as someone who's investing in the African tech ecosystem, I'd love to know what sort of proof points do you look for, and what like things are you looking for when you look at a startup that is enhancing in the tech space, and also that is a green startup as well, or having some sort of impact. Like, what do you look for to validate that investment?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for staying for this last session. So there are three important things that we look for. The very first thing is documented field research. Founders who maybe have spent time with individuals like Milu and their organizations. The second thing that's required as part of this founding team of the startup has to be someone with personally lived experience with the problem. The reason for that is you've validated that the problem is a real problem, and you're not just developing solutions for phantom issues. The third thing, which I think is most important to then articulate to us, is why this digital solution is the best solution as opposed to an analog solution for whatever the problem is.
Cool. And Tendai, maybe give a bit of context into the sort of checks you write and your fund, First Serve Ventures, for the audience.
Give a bit of
an intro onto your fund and what you do for, yeah.
Right, so First Serve Ventures is a pre-revenue software investor. European startups as well as African startups. The reason for that is to open up a corridor. We like to look for European startups that have solved issues that maybe haven't as yet been solved in Africa, and we bring them across. And then also helping African startups to scale globally where they find it quite difficult to do. So first check, pre-revenue, you can't have made any money, and we'll take that bet on you.
Fantastic, that's awesome. Any founders here in the room, hands up? Cool, cool. Okay, you should be pitching this guy, especially if you don't have revenue. And I'd love to hear, Tendai, maybe an example of a company that you would back, or like a company that you have invested in that's actually hit those 3 points that you mentioned, and then a company that maybe sounds like it should receive investment, but you haven't invested in.
Okay, so I met this lady who has spent her whole life working for the South African government's agricultural department, and what they would do was they'd go around the country trying to figure out how they can help farmers. I'm being quite broad with it. She then realized that what happens in South Africa specifically with not commercial farmers, but those who might only have an acre, is they trade entirely in cash. So and South Africa, weirdly, has one major distributor for all of your supplies, your seeds, and so forth. This distributor was handling the equivalent of $3 million in cash per day from farmers. So farmers are all paying in cash. They pay their workers in cash. When they sell their harvest, they're paid in cash. They can never build any form of credit, access finance, grow and develop. She worked with farmers for 20 years across the country. Eventually, she approached this large supplier, VKB, and said that she would like to develop a platform that would allow farms to transact directly through it. This way, they can then transact digitally, because they do have bank accounts, build some credit, and so forth. They said no, but they said if she can't develop the platform, they'll allow all the trade to go through the platform. She then approached the African Development Bank with this proposition. And the reason she approached them is she said, how about if they could be given produce and supplies as working capital loans? So they're given everything up front, they repay when they harvest. That's how they build a credit record. African Development Bank said, we're happy to fund you up to the equivalent of $50 million, right? However, she still had no money to actually develop the platform. When I met her, this was a no-brainer company that was going to work. She's been given $50 million by the African Development Bank. The largest distributor said, we'll put all our goods through your platform. She literally had no money just to build software. And we got involved, and it's currently trading that $3 million
Wow.
through a platform and not in cash anymore, which obviously was a major security hazard as well. So that was a situation where actual farmers are being helped.
Yeah.
We now have a whole new type of entrepreneur, and trade is moving. So it solves a lot of problems.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Indeed. And then your other question about what looks like it should be invested in but not, we receive a lot of pitches from solution-first founders. They say things like, we've developed a blockchain solution to assist beekeepers, do X, Y, Z. But they're coming up with a solution without validating a problem. That happens quite a lot.
Yeah.
As in, it sounds great, but in practice, it's not.
Yeah, fantastic. And I love that example, though, as well, of like getting that proof point, working in the field and being like, this is a solution, let's validate it now with the different stakeholders. So yeah, nice. Okay, we're going to go now to a bit of rapid fire through the panel. I want to ask a couple questions, and I'd love all of you guys to pitch in on it or weigh in on it. So rank today's top barrier for digital and climate growth between policy, capital, or talent, and why? Who wants to start?
I would say talent first. And that's because as a company or as an innovator doing digital and green, you need deep knowledge of so many different things. To go back to the example that I named about satellite imagery-based agricultural services, as an innovator, you need deep knowledge of satellite imagery and geospatial data, relatively tech savvy, and then you also need knowledge about, local climate, what crops are people using, and how does that image then translate into advice on fertilizer, pesticide, and water usage. And combining that knowledge in one company is relatively difficult. And if I look at what most incubators or accelerators are offering in the countries where we work, it's not that technical knowledge. Because it's not really found often within the country, and that's what's actually needed.
Interesting. So the talent is the biggest challenge because of the depth of technicality you need to build these solutions. Would that be?
Yeah, and it's also not always common for research institutes to work together with innovators. So that would really be something to look out for more.
Interesting. And what do we think to our very smart panel here? Like, which of these barriers do we feel is the biggest? Do we agree it's talent, or do we think it might be capital or policy?
I mean, depending on the context, I would put policy and talent. Because in some countries, if it's not allowed and regulated, you cannot do it, even if you have the talent and the capital. And if the right policy is there, even the investor will take the risk with you if you are talented. So depending on the context, and we have various contexts on our continent, I will put the talent for the reasons Milou just mentioned, but also the policy is very important, because the policy will make if the capital will come to you or take the risk, take your risk, investing in you. And sometimes it's very crucial.
Cool, okay. Nice one. So policy also equal level with talent for Tende, how about you?
I firmly believe talent is the baseline of everything, because when you have the talent, you have the solutions being developed. And then policy. Capital follows all of that. Capital is the least important thing. I think if we focus on developing talent, you can just look at the data in Africa, which a study we've just completed, where we looked at every announced raise in Africa by startups over the last 10 years. Somehow, founders are incredible at raising money, but what happens after that is a complete disaster. The only thing that explains that is talent. So clearly the money's there. That's actually the easy thing to get. So talent first as the baseline, followed by policy.
Interesting. Yeah, I completely agree with the talent argument as well. One thing that has repeatedly come up in the ecosystem, especially lately, is this idea of essentially having foreign founders, so founders who are not African, local African founders, who are going and raising money and building companies in Africa. And there's a lot of debate online about whether, is this okay? Is this part of ecosystem development? Or is this actually not acceptable in our ecosystem? And so a question I want to ask to this panel is, how do you think of this idea of like non-local founders building companies in local markets, in local African markets? Do we think that it is a positive thing, or do we think that like it prevents founders on the continent from getting the upside of their ventures? Rim, go ahead.
No, I don't think this is a problem. I mean, no. I've been working on a program in Tunisia that does this specifically, is bringing international founders or investors to invest on the country to create the jobs and also to create value. And there will be like a huge, this creates the dynamic. And this creates the market itself and the ecosystem itself. So I don't think this is a problem, or this prevents African founders from accessing to the opportunities. And this means that if an international founder come to Africa to invest or implement operationally an idea or a business solution, this means that they found something they didn't find outside of the continent, either the conditions or the challenge itself or the market. So this is not necessarily a bad thing, and this will encourage others either to come or to go, to take this journey, either in Africa or in that sector or solving that specific problem. So, we have to be open, and this is where the opportunities come.
100%.
To offer a bit of a different perspective, so we're talking here about transitions. We want to accelerate sustainable transitions by using digital tools. And it seems like as an ecosystem, we think or we assume that we do this by building one very big company, like the winner takes all, what we saw with Mkopa, with the solar home systems. And so the system is on VCs, on business angels, on taking equity, incubating, accelerating, and really hoping that of all of the 100 businesses or entrepreneurs that you're incubating, one will really make it. And I'm wondering, and that's indeed where these Western founders come in that have maybe that experience or that the winner takes all mentality. But is that really what we want? Is that really how we're going to create those transitions? Isn't it better to have 50 companies that maybe also don't want to or don't need to grow towards a unicorn? And we're talking here about green innovations, right? In the examples that I just named, because a local context are so important, and those differ even within a country, it's much more efficient if you have, within one country, 10 or 20 companies offering solar irrigation systems or offering cool transport. So maybe there's also a shift in mindset needed about how we can create those transitions and how our support should then look like.
Yeah, which means it's not winner takes all per se. It's like the more players, the better.
Yeah, and it's stimulating that there's room for more players and stimulating that an entrepreneur grows into a stable SME rather than pushing them to grow even further until they reach, I don't know, 1 million investment. Is that always the best way to grow? I don't think so. Not for green innovations.
Yeah, that's a great take. Nice. Let's skip over to Tende. What's your perspective?
I'd like to be, in any room I'm in, I'd like to believe that the best idea should win. So if someone not from Africa comes and spots an opportunity and has the best idea, I think they should be supported. That's one aspect. Last year, Reem here told me something very interesting that I didn't understand at first, but it actually changed my whole investment thesis. And she said to me, Tendai's startups do not create jobs. They're transformational. At first I thought, well, that's crazy because we know lots of startups that hire a lot of people. However, when I actually went and looked, I'm a statistician by training. When I looked at the numbers of jobs that startups actually create, it will never change an economy ever. But their transformational nature, how they impact the rest of the economy, that's where all the magic happens. So as far as I'm concerned, I genuinely don't care who comes to Africa and builds something, because if it succeeds, what it actually does for the rest of the communities, countries, and economies is far greater. That said, I agree with what Milu is saying as well, in that you need integration with those down on the ground from there. Why? They care about that land, they care about the community, and they're not leaving. So we have to involve them.
That's awesome. I really like that perspective. It's not about jobs, it's transformation for a whole sector. And that in itself is value. Just one thing I want to add to this conversation, because I think it's such a big one that we're talking about as a team, is I think the one thing that we don't realize with other ecosystems is that in most cases you have innovators from other countries who have done it before or have experience doing it in other regions who come and build similarly. And they not only, like a company like Jumia, for instance, one of our biggest tech companies, our founders from Europe, right? But they've trained thousands of people in the tech space who have now built other big companies. So it's actually a necessary step, I think, in an ecosystem's evolution. Let's go to some audience questions. So we have a couple that have come up on the Votemo. We'll get a chance to do, I think, maybe one or two, just given the time. So I want to go to Vasco's question from Allied for Startups. Rim stressed the role of policy. How can Europe support African ecosystems through co-creation, not imposition, and what best practices already exist?
This is a huge question.
2 minutes.
No, actually, cooperation between Europe and Africa, and we've been these days in one of these mechanisms or one of these instruments of collaboration, which is the DGI, the Twin Transition and DGI, Digital and Green Innovation Initiative. So I think there are many projects that are trying to do two things. Supporting with the technology transfer or with building the capacities, but also building bridges. So we can learn from each other and we can support each other. Because it's true that there are many initiatives from Europe supporting the African continent, but there is also a support needed from the other side in terms of knowing our context and knowing our actors. So it's this exchange between the two continents in terms of business, in terms of policy support, in terms of knowledge. That is important. So as I said, there is this DGI, there is the Global Gateway, there is ADIB and the G4G Hub. So yeah,
Fantastic.
many initiatives in this space specifically of entrepreneurship and twin transition.
Okay, fantastic. Cool, and you'll have I noticed a few more questions came in, but we're about to wrap the session. But I think we'll all be around afterwards, probably in this area, so you can come and ask us directly. But I'd love to close with a quick fire round of maybe your biggest takeaway or your biggest thing to leave this audience with from each of you from this session.
Yeah.
Mila, would you like to start?
So the one thing that I hope everybody takes away from this is that accelerating sustainability transitions by using digital tools doesn't require one company, one innovator. It requires 10 or 20 or 30 in the same space. So if you're a policymaker or a donor or an entrepreneurship support organization, ask yourself, am I doing the right things? Am I, with the actions and the projects that I'm doing, accelerating transformation at scale?
Very good. Rim.
Thank you. So maybe the opportunity is there. We need just together. We need to just together put the right components, put the right environment for it, and the right facilitation. So yeah.
Awesome. The right ingredients. Yeah.
I think this is also to do with the question you were just asked, actually. Please be involved in Africa. I highly recommend everyone in this whole place to subscribe to Tech Safari, because when I decided to start spending time back home in Africa after being in London, that's how I got to find out everything that was happening on the continent. And I think that is step one to beginning to learn and then involve yourself into what is going on. So let's all get informed, and then once we have information and some analytics, let's all act.
Love it. Let's hear it for our incredible panel. Thanks to all of you for being here. And thank you for you guys for staying. We'll see you tomorrow at the after party. Thanks.